Imagine two extremely wealthy people. One of them inherited their money, acquiring it through the luck that comes with being born to owners of immense amounts of property and wealth. And the other person worked for what they have. They started at the bottom, and through years of hard work and clever dealing, they built a business empire. Now, which one would you say deserves their wealth? Sociologically, the interesting thing here isn't your answer. Not really. It's the fact that different societies in different times and places have different answers to this question. Because the question of what it means to deserve wealth or success or power is a matter of social stratification. Social stratification is what we're talking about when we talk about inequality. It's a system by which society categorizes people and ranks them in a hierarchy. Everything from social status and prestige to the kind of job you can hold to your chances of living in poverty are affected by social stratification. That's because one of the first principles of social stratification is that it's universal but variable. It shows up in every society on the planet, but what exactly it looks like, how it divides and categorizes people, and the advantages or disadvantages that come with that division vary from society to society. Realizing that social stratification exists in every society brings us to another principle, that stratification is a characteristic of society and not a matter of individual differences. People are obviously all different from each other, so we might assume that stratification is just kind of a natural outcome of those differences, but it's not. We know this because we can see the effects of social stratification on people independent of their personal choices or traits. For example, children of wealthy families are more likely to live longer and be healthier, to attend college, and to excel in school than children born into poverty. And they're also more likely to be wealthy themselves when they grow up. And this highlights another key principle of social stratification. It persists across generations. So stratification serves to categorize and rank members of society, resulting in different life chances. But generally, society allows some degree of social mobility or changes in position within the social hierarchy. People sometimes move upward or downward in social class, and this is what we usually think of when we talk about social mobility. But more common in the United States is horizontal mobility, changing positions without changing your standing in the social hierarchy. This generally happens when a person moves between jobs that pay about the same and have about the same occupational prestige. Like stratification itself, social mobility isn't just a matter of individual achievement. There are structural factors at play too. In fact, we can talk specifically about structural social mobility, when a large number of people move around the hierarchy because of larger societal changes. When a recession hits and thousands of people lose their jobs and are suddenly downwardly mobile, that's structural mobility. But stratification isn't just a matter of economic forces and job changes, which brings us to another aspect of social stratification. It isn't just about economic and social inequalities. It's also about beliefs. A society's cultural beliefs tell us how to categorize people, and they also define the inequalities of a stratification system as being normal, even fair. Put simply, if people didn't believe that the system was right, it wouldn't last. Beliefs are what make the systems of social stratification work. And it's these beliefs about social stratification that inform what it means to deserve wealth or success or power. These four principles give us a better understanding of what social stratification is, but they still haven't told us much about what it looks like in the real world. So sociologists classify stratification systems as being either closed or open. Closed systems tend to be extremely rigid and allow for little social mobility. In these systems, social position is based on ascribed status, or the social position you inherit at birth. On the other hand, open systems of stratification allow for much more social mobility, both upward and downward. Social position tends to be achieved, not ascribed. Now, these terms are pretty theoretical, so let's look at some examples of more closed or open systems, as well as societies that fall in the middle. The archetypal closed system is a caste system. Of these, India's caste system is probably one of the best known, and while it's a social system of decreasing importance, it still holds sway in parts of rural India, and it has a strong legacy across the country. Let's go to the thought bubble. The traditional caste system contains four large divisions called varnas: Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Sudra. Together, these varnas encompass hundreds of smaller groups called jatis at the local level. The caste system in its traditional form is a clear example of an extremely rigid, closed, and unequal system. Caste position not only determined what jobs were acceptable, but it also strongly controlled its members' everyday lives and life outcomes. The system required endogamy, or marriage within your own caste category. And in everyday life, the caste system determined who you could interact with and how, with systems of social control restricting contact between lower and higher castes. And this whole system was based on a set of strong cultural and religious beliefs, establishing caste as a right of birth and living within the strictures of your caste as a moral and spiritual duty. Thanks, Thought Bubble. We see a variation of the caste system in feudal Europe with the division of society into 3 orders or estates: the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. Again, a person's birth determined his social standing. Commoners, for instance, paid the most taxes and owed labor to their local lord, so they had little expectation that they'd rise above their station. The whole social order was justified on the belief that it was ordained by God, with the nobility ruling by so-called divine right. Both caste systems use ancestry and lineage as a main principle of social stratification, but race has also been used as the main distinction in closed social systems. The South African system of apartheid, for instance, maintained a legally enforced separation between black people and white people for decades. Apartheid denied black people citizenship, the ability to own land, and any say whatsoever in the national government. The Jim Crow laws of the American South were another example, as was slavery before that. In contrast with caste systems, class systems are the archetypal open systems. They aren't based solely on ascribed status at birth. Instead, they combine ascribed status and personal achievement in a way that allows for some social mobility. Class is the system of stratification that we have in American society. The main difference between caste and class systems is that class systems are open and social mobility is not legally restricted to certain people. There aren't formally defined categories in the same way that there are in the traditional Indian caste system. Being in the underclass in the US is not equivalent to being an untouchable from India. In class systems, the boundaries between class categories are often blurred, and there's greater opportunity for social mobility into and out of class positions. The American system of stratification is founded on this very idea, in fact, that it's possible through hard work and perseverance to move up the social hierarchy to achieve a higher class standing. And this points to another difference in systems of stratification. Instead of ancestry, lineage, or race being the key to social division, the American system has elements of a meritocracy, which is a system in which social mobility is based on personal merit and individual talents. The American dream is that anyone, no matter how poor, can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and become upwardly class mobile through nothing but hard work and gumption. That American system is certainly more meritocratic than feudal Europe or traditional India, but the idea of meritocracy is as much a justification for inequality as it is an actual principle of stratification. In an open class-based system of stratification, it's easy to believe that anyone who's not upwardly mobile deserves their poverty. Because a meritocratic class system is supposed to be open, it's easy to ignore the structural factors that influence class standing. But just as the Indian caste system and feudal estate system place their limits on certain groups, the American class system limits just how far hard work can take some people. The US class system tends to reproduce existing class inequalities because the advantages that you start with have an incredibly powerful impact on where you can end up. This is part of the reason that the US is still stratified along race and gender lines. That said, these inequalities are no longer explicitly enshrined in the law, which is an example of the greater openness of class systems. Because of this openness, class systems also have a greater likelihood of opportunity for individuals to experience status inconsistency, a situation where a person's social position has both positive and negative influences on their social status. Stratification isn't just a matter of one thing, after all. When we talk about socioeconomic status, for instance, we're including 3 things: income, education, and occupational prestige. An example of status inconsistency is an adjunct professor who's very well educated but earns a low income. There's an inconsistency among these different aspects of their social status. Low income tends to decrease social status, while at the same time, a high level of education and the societal respect for the occupation of college professor improves social status. All these comparisons between closed and open systems might make it sound like they're totally different. A system is either one or the other. But really, they're 2 poles on a spectrum. Not every society is strictly a caste system or a class system. Modern Britain, for instance, is a good illustration of a mixed system of stratification. It still maintains a limited caste system of nobility as a legacy of the feudal system of estates, which survives alongside and helps reinforce a class system similar to what we have in the US. And some systems of stratification even claim that its citizens are entirely equal, as the Soviet Union did. Following the Russian Revolution of 1917, the USSR was established as a theoretically classless society. But inequality is more than just economic, and Soviet society was stratified into 4 groups, each of which held various amounts of political power and prestige: apparatchiks, or government officials, intelligentsia, industrial workers, and the rural peasantry. So, like I mentioned before, stratification is universal but variable. If you want to study a society, one of the things that you need to look at is the way that it's stratified and whether and how social mobility occurs. Today we learned about social stratification. We talked about 4 basic principles of a sociological understanding. Class matters. You probably already know that, and not only because you're a student of sociology, but because you're a person who lives in a society. But do you know how much it really matters? Social class is a huge determinant of many of the most fundamental aspects of modern life, from your education to your beliefs, as well as your values, your occupation, your income, and not only how you live, but also how you die. So let's talk about how class plays out in the lives of Americans today. Class starts to matter at the very beginning of your life. When we discussed socialization a few episodes ago, we talked about anticipatory socialization, or learning to fit into a group you'll someday be a part of, like a gender or a race. And one type of anticipatory socialization is class socialization, where parents convey to their children the values that go along with being upper class or middle class or working class. Let's take a simple example. Suppose you're a parent and your kid absolutely refuses to eat broccoli. How do you respond? Do you make them clear their plate and say that they shouldn't waste food? Or do you allow them to make decisions for themselves about what they eat? Now, you may be thinking, what? How does eating broccoli have anything to do with class? But how parents from different walks of life approach parenting can differ a lot by class, as American sociologist Annette Lareau found in her research on parenting styles. Let's go to the thought bubble to look at how social class can affect what kind of parent you are or what kind you have. In the 1990s, Lareau's research focused on observing families of elementary school students from upper middle class and working class backgrounds. In doing this, she realized that parents had very different approaches to how they educated and disciplined their kids. She found that upper middle class parents tend to be very involved in their kids' social and academic lives. Think scheduled playdates, after-school activities, checking their homework assignments every night. The stereotype of a suburban helicopter mom isn't too far from the mark for some of these families. By contrast, working-class parents who were more likely to have less time and money to devote to these activities were more likely to be hands-off in structuring their kids' free time. These kids might be more likely to be playing with whoever is around their neighborhood than going on playdates. Working-class parents also tend to put a greater emphasis on obedience and discipline compared to their upper-middle-class counterparts, Lareau found. While a working-class parent might tell their kids to eat their broccoli because I said so, an upper middle-class parent is more likely to talk through decisions with their children in an effort to encourage autonomy. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So yes, a toddler's distaste for broccoli and their parents' reaction to it can tell us something about class. And these trends in parenting aren't the only difference in values and beliefs that we see across classes. Political views tend to vary across class groups too, with upper-class Americans being more likely to be fiscally conservative and socially progressive, and lower-class Americans being more likely to be the opposite. Even religion varies by class. Upper-income Americans are more heavily represented in liberal Protestant groups like Episcopalians, Presbyterians, as well as Judaism, Hinduism, and atheism, whereas lower-income Americans are more likely to identify as evangelical Protestants or Catholics. But beliefs and values aren't the only thing that vary by social class. A large component of class differences plays out through educational attainment and its consequences for success later in life. Education is sometimes called the great equalizer. The more people who have access to quality education, the more equal a society gets, or so the thinking goes. But whether you get a quality education varies by the social class you're born into, so we might be concerned that education will have the opposite effect and will actually help pass inequalities from one generation on to the next. There are a few ways that social class comes into play when we talk about education in the US. First, where do you live? Income segregation, or the tendency for families of similar income levels to live in the same neighborhoods, is incredibly common in the United States. If you've ever gone apartment hunting in a big city, this might not come as a surprise to you. An apartment in a good neighborhood or an area with low crime, good schools, and better quality housing costs way more than a home where crime and pollution are higher and education and job access is inconsistent. One reason that access to education varies by class is that public schools in the US are funded mainly at the local level. So kids who grow up in affluent neighborhoods tend to have access to better schools because those communities provide more funding. So living in a better neighborhood tends to mean access to better educational facilities, as well as to technology like computers, good teachers, and a wider variety of classes and extracurriculars. And that's assuming you go to a public school. Upper-class children are more likely to attend private schools, and this trend continues when we get past high school. We mentioned this last week. Children who grow up working class or low income are much less likely to attend college, and those who do are much more likely to attend public state schools or two-year community colleges. Among elite colleges, most students don't come from low-income families. They come from the very top of the income distribution. A recent study of social class and college attendance found that 38 elite colleges, including 5 in the Ivy League, Brown, Dartmouth, Penn, Princeton, and Yale, had more students who came from the top 1% than the entire bottom 60% of the income distribution. Some of this inequality in college access is helped along by the policy of preferential admittance for so-called legacy students, whose parents or other family members attended the college. Policies like this entrench class inequalities across generations by making it less likely that those from lower socioeconomic classes will move up the ladder. Plus, the social networks formed within prestigious colleges often are the stepping stones toward jobs and financial success later in life, which again makes it more likely that inequality will get passed on to a new generation. And of course, political and economic power tend to be concentrated among those at the top of the social class ladder. Dreaming of being president when you grow up? Of the 10 presidents who have held office in the last 50 years, 6 attended an Ivy League school for either their undergrad or postgrad studies. Every single one had at least a bachelor's degree. So education can seem less like the great equalizer in this case than the great barrier. Without a college degree, there are jobs that are pretty much impossible to get. The jobs that you can get without a college degree tend to come with lower prestige, lower pay, and a greater risk of occupational dangers. Which brings us to the last class difference we'll be talking about today: health. Social class affects how you live, but it also affects how you die. Mortality and disease rates vary by social class, with upper-class Americans living longer and healthier lives. A man in the 80th percentile, or top of the income distribution, lives an average of 84 years, while a man at the bottom, in the 20th percentile, lives an average of 78 years. Women live longer than men typically. Yay for us! But the income gap is still similar here, with women in the 80th percentile living about 4.5 years longer than those in the 20th percentile. Why the huge gap? Some reasons might seem obvious. If you have more money, you can probably afford better healthcare, or for that matter, afford any healthcare. Others are maybe less straightforward. For example, low-income Americans tend to eat less healthy food. Now, is that just a matter of different choices made by different people, or is it a systematic pattern that links class with eating habits? Well, oftentimes, unhealthy foods are cheaper, both in terms of money and time. Lower-class Americans tend to have less leisure time and less money to spend on cooking healthy meals. After all, it takes a lot less time and money to pick up McDonald's than to spend an hour cooking a meal with expensive organic vegetables. Additionally, many low-income Americans live in what are known as food deserts, or neighborhoods without easy access to fresh foods like fruits and vegetables. Other systematic class differences come from the occupations that different classes tend to hold. Upper and middle-class Americans are more likely to be in white-collar, full-time jobs, which generally have lower exposure to dangerous materials and lower risks of accidents on the job. Not to mention more flexible work schedules. Less danger and less stress equals better health. Plus, full-time jobs are more likely to provide benefit packages, including health insurance and paid sick days. It's much harder to take care of your health if you can't take the time off work to go to the doctor or rest and recover. But that's the reality for many working-class Americans. Class gaps in health outcomes are clearly about more than just having the money to pay for better health care. It's about occupation, neighborhood, income, education, and all the different ways that advantages like these can overlap and determine your life course. That's why social class matters. It gives us a way to identify the advantages and disadvantages that different groups of people share, and understand the consequences of those advantages and disadvantages. Today, we discussed 3 types of class differences we see playing out in the United States. First, the beliefs and values parents pass on to the next generation will vary by class. Second, there are class gaps in educational attainment which help perpetuate inequality across generations. And finally, Americans of lower socioeconomic status tend to have worse health and shorter lifespans than those with higher class status. Next time, we'll focus on a